Thank you for listening to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Stitcher. Also, please follow Matt's Movie Reviews on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Reddit, Instagram, and MeWe. And of course, be sure to visit mattsmoviereviews.net for the latest reviews, top 10 lists, and more. Now, on to the show.
There's about 57 Muslim states in the world. There's one Jewish state.
The massive ingathering of Jews in the last 150 years back to the land is absolutely unprecedented.
They say that there's no greater sign of redemption coming than the Jewish people returning to the hills of Judea.
As a Christian, I've always supported Israel's claim to the Holy Land. To me, the Palestinians were just getting in the way of God's plan. But the way I viewed the other side created a conflict within me.
I cannot comprehend in any way God's will for a certain group of people having to deal directly with the suffering of another people.
300,000 Palestinians are unemployed.
Most Palestinians have only seen Israeli soldiers and settlers, and I tell you, they are not very friendly.
I don't hate. But if you throw a stone at me or try and stab me, I will kill you.
Can you imagine as a child you grew up in the Palestinian society, all what has been heard about the Jews, they want to kill us, they want to drink our blood. So what I felt is full of bitterness, full of hate.
أمسك صهيوني ولا إسرائيلي بقتله قتل موت. أنا بكرههم.
I don't think that people hate Palestinians. People don't want just to live. They don't want to die.
Hello and welcome to the Matt's Movie Reviews podcast. I am your host, Matthew Pejkovic, and this is episode number 360. Out now on digital and Blu-ray is Hope in the Holy Land, a documentary that follows American Christian Todd Morehead as he travels across the Holy Land to confront his indifference toward the Palestinians in the search for the deeper truths behind one of the most perplexing and debated conflicts in the world. A compelling and illuminating delve into a contentious issue that has no end in sight. Hope in the Holy Land dares to ask the question, what will it take for Israel and Palestine to put aside their differences as adversaries and love one another as neighbors? And joining me now to talk about Hope in the Holy Land is none other than Todd Morehead himself. Todd, I thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Matt.
So, reading up about yourself and about the documentary, you know, you've been to Israel a whole bunch of times before you even did this film in your previous film, Promised Land. I think you've taken groups over there maybe 25 times or so. What was the appeal to Israel to you to the extent that you have arranged, even before making these documentaries that you have in Hope in the Holy Land and the Promised Land beforehand, that you've arranged people to go over there and see the country and take part of it? What was the overall appeal to it, to yourself as both a Christian and just as a human being?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And, it started really young. I would say preteens. God really put the Jewish people and Israel on my heart. And at the time, I thought it was totally normal that every Christian had a love for the Jewish people and even maybe a fascination with Israel. As I grew up, I quickly realized that this was not the case. But nevertheless, my passion grew, and I began taking people over there in 2006. And I used to take surfers over there, and we would do like surf trips to the Holy Land and see it's like a biblical pilgrimage and add surfing to it. And then I would just take, non-surfers as well over the years as well. And so that led into the Promised Land movie, which I made, which is a story of Israel told through the eyes of surfers. Israel has, a surf population of like 20 to 30,000. And they all have the same story of every other Israeli. And I thought, what a unique perspective to tell the story of Israel through their lens. So one thing kind of led to another, and then Open the Holy Land was birthed out of even Promised Land, I would say.
With Promised Land, you directed that film, but with
Correct.
Hope in the Holy Land, you have Jesse Schlantz who directs this one. Why the decision to move away from directing in regards to this film? Was it a case of the subject being so dense and so large and you needing to be a person on screen interviewing different people and such? Did you just feel that maybe directing this time needed to be handed to someone else for that, just that extra assistance in regards to this project?
Yeah, and I felt where I was best used is more of a producer role, and obviously the story is told through my character. So just being freed up to not have to deal with all that stuff, and even the producer title, I didn't produce so much while in the field. It was Justin Crone who produced while we were in the field, but we both produced and created the film together. And most of my producing was before and after the filming trips. And we did 3 filming trips for this particular movie, for Hope in the Holy Land.
That started from what I've read, it was 2016, 2017, 2018. Those are 3 different years you went over?
Right, correct.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, that timeline between 2016 and 2020, of course, when the Trump administration was in, and there's a lot of people talk about how when he was in office in the Middle East, specifically in Israel, there was not much violence as it were, even in this year. Did you feel yourself that when you were over there, that when Trump was president of America, that there was a different type of feeling in the air in Israel compared to previous years?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I noticed anything on the ground, because it's not always just on the ground, but it's like a regional, there could be a regional tensity or a regional peace as well. And I know that is true, that the region and even the Palestinian territories in Israel, they did much better under the Trump administration than previous years, and then even right now. But did I notice it on the ground? I can't tell you that it was like much different for me.
It's interesting. You are treading into new territory, not only philosophically and ideologically, but literally you're going into areas you probably haven't been before. In regards to where to go, who to talk to, what type of prep do you need to kind of know which places and which people to talk to about this issue while you're over in Israel and Palestine? With your previous trips there, have you made friends on both sides of the of the debate, or did you have to really kind of reach out and talk to people maybe you haven't talked to before in order to get to the answers that you're searching for?
Yeah, most of this was new territory for both Justin Crone and I, and our contacts came through just reaching out consistently to people and talking about the film. And then we'd get networked with somebody they would say, you need to talk to this guy. This is the guy you need to interview. We get a hold of that person, schedule an interview for that next trip. And that's really how it went all the way through the 5-year process. It was a 5-year production for us. So, and post-production, sorry. But yes, tons of networking, and it was all very new as far as who we were meeting with.
When it came to the title of the film, I also read, I think I heard an interview that Justin did where he talked about previously the title of the film was Hope for the Holy Land, and that changed to Hope in the Holy Land. And clearly yourself, Todd, and Justin and everyone else involved with the film is approaching the film, approaching the subject with hope, with the hope that there's a spirit will come from this and that hopefully perceptions will change. But once you're out there and once you're talking to people, and do you ever find yourself kind of like doubting the aim of the project? Do you ever find yourself thinking that maybe we can't find a spirit that can bring everyone together here? We can't find the answers to the questions that we're looking for?
Oh, I would say that during the darkest moments of the filming, that thought was very heavy on my heart, that it seemed very hopeless. And that's well documented in the movie. And then obviously things changed, and we found aspects of hope and silver lining as well. So I do remember the day that we changed the film from Hope for the Holy Land to the title, from Hope for the Holy Land to Hope in the Holy Land. And it's when we were in the land, and Justin came out of his bedroom before we were, one morning preparing, and he comes out of his bedroom as if we were already in a conversation. I hadn't even said anything to him that day. And he's like, it's hope in the Holy Land. It's hope in the Holy Land. And I think the difference there was we were there. It took on a whole different meaning from the word for to in, because we're actually participating in what that hope might look like.
When I watched the movie afterwards, I was thinking to myself, this is a movie about perceptions and confirmations. And what I mean by that is I think everyone approaches contentious issues like the Israel-Palestine kind of conflict with perceptions about who is who, what is what, etc. When you approached this subject yourself, did you have perceptions about what was going on over there? And after you had your 5-year experience of putting this film together, talking to people, boots on the ground, did any of your perceptions confirmed, or did you find the majority of them were confronted and changed?
Oh, that's a great question. I had, and nobody goes into anything with a clean slate, especially after being in Israel over 25 times. So I had a lot of preconceived ideas. And as I began to do more man on the street interviews, especially within the Palestinian territories or Judea or Samaria, those perceptions were actually confirmed, but it was confirmed more radically than I ever imagined with the just viral anti-Semitism and the hatred towards Israelis. It really, and they would say Zionists. They wouldn't say they wouldn't say Jews. They would say, we hate the Zionists. But what they're saying is any Jew who has national aspirations in that land, they hate them. And so that stuff was confirmed for me. And I'll give you a couple examples. We would go and do man on the street interviews both in Israel and the Palestinian territories. And I would ask a set of the same questions. And then when I got into the Palestinian territories, we would ask them conspiracy theory questions to see if that's really what they held true, because that's what we heard. Some of them, I'll read a couple to you. Do you believe the Jews want to take over the whole world? Do you believe the Holocaust happened? Do you believe the Jews were the ones who attacked the USA on 9/11? Do you believe the stabbing attacks a few years ago were faked by the Israeli government? And do you believe the Jews are sons of apes and pigs? Almost all of these questions were affirmed. And then when we get to the Holocaust, they would say, a lot of them would say, no, I don't believe the Holocaust happened. Or if it did happen, the numbers were far exaggerated. They were more like 6,000 or something, and they only exaggerated them so the world would be sympathetic, so they could come take us over, kind of thing. So that stuff was far more radical than I had ever anticipated. And then, but where I was confronted was the humanity. And when you start talking to people on both sides of the conflict, and you begin to, and you have, you share a dinner with them or a lunch with them, you began to see them as image bearers of God, and all people matter to God. And that's what changed it for me. That the Palestinians I met, who I might have formerly thought as, my enemy, even, I became, I gained a lot of friendships, and I tried my very best to see what life was like through their eyes, and to have empathy with them. And there's some amazing people, and the Palestinians are known for being incredibly hospitable. So I would say I was confronted in that stuff of how I actually viewed the Palestinians.
I think what's important about your film, which I really appreciate, is that you do go out to places like Palestine and you communicate with people, you talk to people, you ask the questions and you seek the answers. And I think that's something that's really missing from our day and age, especially like in the Western world, as it is in America, as it is in Australia. People have seemed to be more divided and cemented into their own kind of like viewpoints of how things are and don't want to budge about things. And I think what's really cool about Hope in the Holy Land is that you talk to people and you are confronted with this kind of like really strong kind of anti-Semitism and such. But then when you delve deeper, you find out that a lot of this is really generational indoctrination. Sometimes people talk this way because they're taught the wrong thing. And I think it's really important for people to realize that a lot of times hatred or of another person or suspicions upon another person comes from generations of indoctrination from beforehand. And I think that's something that, especially in regards to the Palestinian people, that's something that really needs to be confronted, isn't it? I mean, things aren't going to change until, barriers are broken down and they actually find out who exactly the Israeli people are as opposed to who they perceive the Israeli people are.
Yeah, that makes all the difference. Actually, and educating people for peace. For over 70 years, the Palestinians have been indoctrinated to hate, and it's become part of their school curriculums. It's actually a part of the UN curriculum. The UN curriculum just adopted the Palestinian curriculum. So they were never, those poor children over there are still indoctrinated to hate, and they're taught the most terrible things about Israelis and about Jews, much like what happened in Nazi Germany. They believe almost all of that stuff. The protocols of the Elders of Zion, all that stuff that led up to the Holocaust is widely accepted in the Palestinian world. And so it's those brave souls within the Palestinian society who have stepped out of the comforts of what their narrative is, what's acceptable within in their social circles, and they've gone outside to make Israeli friends, Jewish friends, and they realize that there's humanity on the other side, and there's actually very, very good people on the other side, not like what they've been taught at all, not even close to what they've been taught. And that's actually happened on both sides, but within the Palestinian territories, that's the difference between those Arabs who know the truth of what's going on and those who are just stuck within their society.
The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by 80s Tees. 80s Tees is an online retailer of licensed t-shirts and pop culture gear from your favorite movies, TV shows, cartoons, video games, comic books, and musicians. Celebrate your inner 80s nerd and click on the link in the show notes below to get the raddest retro t-shirts delivered to your door. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is brought to you by Loot Crate. Founded in 2012, Loot Crate is the worldwide leader in fan subscription boxes. Loot Crate partners with industry leaders in entertainment, gaming, sports, and pop culture to deliver monthly themed crates, produce interactive experiences in digital content, and film original video productions. No matter what you geek out about, Loot Crate has a subscription box for you. To get your very own exclusive collectibles, apparel, and gear delivered to your door, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. The Matt's Movie Reviews podcast is also brought to you by Vudu. Watch the latest movies and TV shows anytime, anywhere. No subscriptions, no contract. Enjoy stunning quality in up to 4K ultra high definition at home and download and watch on your mobile device as well. To rent and buy from over 100,000 titles or watch thousands of movies free with Vudu Movies on us, be sure to click on the link in the show notes below. Now, back to the show. How much of all of this do you think is theologically driven versus politically driven? because I find that, so my background is Croatian. And as you remember from a couple of decades back, there was a very similar kind of a war that happened in the former Yugoslavia between the Croatians and the Serbians, and even that kind of conflict goes back generational. I mean, there's a lot of things happening there that's very similar to what's happening right now and has been happening between Israel and Palestine. And a lot of the times, theological and even like a religious kind of elements kind of creep into the political thing, and it all kind of turns to this really kind of murky kind of minefield that people kind of exploit a lot of the times. And I found it really interesting that when you were speaking to Palestinian Christians, they brought up something called Palestinian liberation theology. And from what I can gather from it, it's pretty much them taking the Bible, but then twisting things in the Bible to suit their political agenda. Is that a kind of like a correct assessment of that?
That's a great assessment. It's taking things and twisting it, and then ignoring entire swaths of scripture that don't agree with your narrative. Huge, entire books. So simply put, though, you did a great job.
But when it comes to the other side of the debate, when a lot of people are critical of Israel, there's certain factors that come up. One of the big ones is a whole issue of settlements in the West Bank. And you actually went out and you talked to people who are in those settlements, Israeli people, a lot of them from America, surprisingly, people from America going over to Israel and then claiming what they perceive as their birthright and such. When it comes to the whole issue of settlements and such, that is such a big thorn in the crawl of many people in regards to the whole Israel-Palestinian conflict. What was your perception of that when you're going into it? And after talking to the people in the settlements, even though you know what their intentions are and you know where they're coming from, do you still believe that perhaps that kind of whole issue, unless that is really tackled and really kind of settled, unless that issue is taken care of, there won't be any type of steps towards trying to find peace between Palestine and Israel?
Yeah, so my perception of settlers before was probably what you would see in the mainstream media in the West. A negative perception of settlers that, they're stealing land, kind of Wild West gun yielding, even racist. And then when I met the ones that I met quite a few. It shattered everything, all my perceptions. And it turns out that the settlers that I met had way more Palestinian friends and relationships and business co-ops than, let's say, the average Israeli, for sure. I mean, the average Israeli doesn't even meet a Palestinian. But those settlers are living next to Palestinians, and they're the ones that are actually working with them and forging new business opportunities. And it's remarkable. And I didn't meet any of that hate. Obviously there's racism everywhere. There's hate everywhere. But to categorize settlers as racists or, having hatred towards Palestinians, I would say that's just not true of what I've seen. There is that fringe element. But so that, that was really eye-opening for me to actually meet them and to experience that. And sorry, what was the second part of that question?
Well, I was just talking about when it comes to settlements themselves, doesn't it have to come down to the fact that that approach really needs to be tackled head on before any steps can be moved forward to garnering some type of peace there in between Israel and Palestine?
Yeah, so that would be the popular narrative that is commonly pushed. I would say no, that is not the problem. And in fact, you go to the universities or anywhere where there's Palestinian marches liberating Palestine, and which are huge. They're prolific. They're all over the world. Their slant is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And what does that mean?
It pretty much means the abolition of the Israeli state.
The entire thing, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, it will all be the Palestinians or the Arabs, and the Jews will be kicked out. And that's what they've been saying all along. They'll say one thing to the West, the leadership, and they will say something totally different in Arabic pushing the Jews into the sea and wiping them out. And that's what they said in 1948 during that war, and that's what they said up in many of the other wars where they tried to completely annihilate the Jewish state.
How much do you think in regards to the perceptions that we did have beforehand, especially in regards to the whole issue of settlements and such, how much do you think the media takes responsibility for pushing that narrative forward, especially in regards to, there's this whole kind of movement happening now, which is the BDS movement, which you approach in the documentary. And for people who don't know, BDS means boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It pretty much is a protest movement it's an activist movement to urge companies or artists, etc., not to visit Israel or promote their product in Israel, etc. And actually, recently, I think Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, actually said that they're going to not do anything in Israel anymore, which it's kind of mind-boggling to me why an ice cream company would delve into these kind of things in the first place. But regardless of that, how much do you think the media takes responsibility for a lot of these things, the perceptions and narratives that people have towards Israel as a country in regards to the conflict between Israel and Palestine?
I would say the vast majority is their responsibility. I could see if they handled it much different, perceptions would be a lot more clear, or the knowledge of what's really going on would be a lot more clear. I mean, we're living in a world where Hamas has become freedom fighters. I mean, a terrorist organization that seeks to destroy innocent civilians, and they're not much different than Al-Qaeda or ISIS. They're not that far less radical, and yet our Western media has almost given them like a free pass of like, you guys are the freedom fighters. You guys can shoot 10,000 rockets at Israeli civilians, and we won't say much about it. But when Israel defends itself, we'll make sure we're right there and posting all the pictures of that Hamas has given them of dead Palestinian children who, and in those cases, a lot of those poor children that died were from rockets that were fired from within Gaza that didn't even make it over the border. But nobody cares. Once Hamas releases those photos to the AP or whoever it is, damage is done, and people believe it.
When it comes to this documentary, it's really interesting. Like I said before, my background is Croatian, and I've gone through my family and people of Croatia went through a similar thing with the war against Serbia. That ended up being peacefully resolved after many years, and now both countries live in peace side by each other. You look at Ireland as well, around the same time in the late 80s, early 90s, between the Protestants and the Catholics, and then that kind of reached a point as well of peace accords and such. The whole Israel and Palestine kind of like, it just feels like that's more further away than before, especially in regards to this year. We've seen a recent spate of attacks between both countries and everything that happened there. When it comes to your documentary, there's a spirit to it that really hopes that we can find the humanity between both sides, and that people do talk to each other and try to find a resolution. But how hopeful should we find that could happen? I mean, it has happened before in other countries, but do you think the Israel-Palestine conflict is on its own kind of thing and can't be compared to anything else? And because of that, maybe new approaches need to be taken to how to achieve peace between both countries?
Wow. Yeah. I don't know how to compare it to other conflicts, just because I'm not an expert on any other conflict, nor am I an expert on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But it's a very complicated situation. And what we're doing with the media is actually making it worse. And so we talked about BDS. BDS is boycott, divest, and sanctions, claims to be for the Palestinian people, but it's actually making things worse. And they're totally against normalizing relationships with Israelis and Palestinians, which leads to peace. That leads to business opportunities and flourishing of economies for two peoples, but they're against that. So by feeding into these narratives, these false narratives, we're actually making the situation worse. So, we didn't set out to solve the conflict by any means.
No.
But we want to be people who stand for truth and what is right. And so we want to, part of what we want to do is to give voice to those Arabs who are standing up for what is right and who are risking their lives to stand up for what is right. And they really are. They live in a society where they can, if they're caught normalizing their, with Israelis, meaning being friends with Jews and Israelis, they could be killed. It's like treason. So we want to give voice to those people, because who are you? Who's most likely to be telling the truth? The guy who is, towing the party line for 70 years, who's saying what everybody else is saying about the Israelis and about the situation, or the guy in his society who is willing to risk his life just to stand up for the truth? It's probably the guy who's willing to risk his life, because he's taking way more risk of what he's saying and what he's trying to tell the world. So we're trying to give voice to those people.
In the end, though, it's all about having a spirit of love for your neighbor, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So whether there ever, is peace in our lifetime, it's not really the point. It's the point is how in our hearts, how are we going to view them? Are we going to hate them, or are we going to love them as Jesus did? Love is, he commanded, love your enemies. And that's really the hardest part. And I made the film, and I'm challenged by this, because you have neighbors and you have things that make you mad. And I'm daily confronted with what I learned in filming for Hope in the Holy Land. And that's to love those people in my life who seem rather unlovable to me. And it's not something I could do on my own. That's something that I believe that only the strength of Jesus can do in me. But that's really the essence right there.
So for everyone listening, Hope in the Holy Land, available now on digital and Blu-ray. You can go in hopeintheholyland.com to actually buy or rent the copy on digital, or to purchase the Blu-ray. And it's available now on Salem now. But Todd, you were telling me off air before that at the end of August, I think it was, it's going to be available on other platforms as well.
August 15th, it will be available on all the major platforms like iTunes and the like, and it should be available in Australia as well.
So for everyone out there listening, mark that in your calendar. For people who can, go to hopeintheholyland.com, seek it out, this movie, this documentary, watch it. It's a beautifully made documentary. I forgot to say that as well. You come across a lot of documentaries, and the quality of the film, the filmmaking isn't the best, but the filmmaking here is quite excellent as well. So a really great work there, Todd. And congratulations to you and to your crew to really going out there, boots on the ground, talking to people. I think it's really important that people talk to one another and get to the bottom of these issues, because otherwise all you have left at the end of the day is just your perceptions, and that could be a dangerous thing. And I think open communication and talking about the issues and hashing things out is the way to go. And, like you said, your documentary isn't going to bring about, peace in the Middle East, and no one would imagine that to be so, but it's important to get the conversation started, and I think you're doing a great job there. So congrats with the documentary, and hopefully we can talk again in the future. If you have future movies, please let me know, and I'd love to talk to you again.
Sounds good. I look forward to it.
Thank you for watching the Matt's Movie Reviews channel. Please subscribe for more reviews, podcast interviews, and exclusive content. Also, if you would like to request a review and support my work, please join my Patreon via the link in the description below.